Welcome to my series on The Great Gatsby. This is Marianne, your trusty art historian, and this series of videos is going to give you an in-depth analysis of the novel, together with lots of supplemental material, images, and documentation that will help the novel come alive for you and give you new ideas to explore. If you're a teacher, I hope it gives you some new approaches to the novel. If you're a student, I hope it helps you appreciate the novel, maybe in a little bit more fulsome way, because I am an art historian, I bring in lots of the material, culture, art, architecture, newspaper illustrations, magazine illustrations, and so forth to make my points. Now, all the pages that I refer to come from the Scribner paperback edition with notes and preface by the scholar Matthew Broccoli from 1995. I've given you the ISBN number here. Now, here we have a photograph of F. Scott Fitzgerald, probably when he was in his mid to late 20s. He was born in 1896 and he died in 1940, an early, untimely, and kind of tragic death in Los Angeles, where he was working as a screenwriter. But he had great ambitions for The Great Gatsby. And he writes to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, he says, quote, "I want to write something new, something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned." In other words, he wanted to surpass his previous two novels, which were commercially successful, but perhaps weren't as artistic and as meaningful as Fitzgerald would have wanted them to be. And certainly his work with magazines. He did a lot of articles in the Saturday Evening Post. He was a prolific writer for magazines, and these magazine articles made him a lot of money, and he was pretty much dependent on them to keep his and his wife Zelda's lifestyle going, because it was an extravagant lifestyle, to be sure. And so for The Great Gatsby, he wanted to do something different, something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned. Now, his ambitions for the novel, of course, did not come to fruition during his lifetime. You know, today the novel sells around 500,000 copies a year in the U.S. alone. But back at the time of his death in 1940, it virtually was not even stocked on the shelves of bookstores. There were copies of it in Scribner's warehouse, but all of the sales of the novel came from F. Scott Fitzgerald himself, who would buy them and then give them away to his friends. But now we know the novel to be one of the most timeless and meaningful novels about America that we have. And it's timeless, yes, but it's also important to remember that it's also very much of its time. And today we're going to look at how it is of its time. What were the things that were going on in America and abroad that make the novel so much of its time? So what are some of these major issues? The first is World War I and its aftermath. The second is Prohibition, the ban on alcohol. The third was immigration from Europe. And the fourth is the great migration of blacks from the rural South to the industrialized North. We're going to look at each of these in turn and use some original sources so that you can really get a sense and a feel for what the atmosphere in the country was in 1922, which is the year in which The Great Gatsby is set. About 100 years ago, this is when the novel was set. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, of course, World War I. We know the book is set in 1922, and it was published in the spring of 1925. And America had joined World War I in April of 1917, and the war ends in November 11th to be exact, 1918. And I want to just notice that on the left, we have a newspaper article, the Montgomery Journal, which came from Zelda Fitzgerald's scrapbook. Zelda had met Scott when Scott, as a soldier, was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama, where Zelda lived with her well-to-do family. And so he never actually made it to the front. He was mostly stationed around various southern cities, Louisville being one, Montgomery being the other. And the Declaration of Peace was important. And you'll notice here in her scrapbook, a newspaper article, it says, "Peace comes to the world." And then this, where it's cut out here, it's obviously Huns quit. The Huns was a derogatory term that they used for the Germans. And so we have this importance that is placed on the end of the war. And you'll recall in the novel that both Jay Gatsby and Nick Carraway served in the United States military during the Great War. Another thing to remember about the novel is that Nick's uncle paid someone else to go to the Civil War for him. He was from an upper class background, he had money, so he could pay for someone else to fight for him. And Fitzgerald was very aware of the kinds of privileges that wealthy people, people with good backgrounds and who are well connected, the advantages they might have over others. And so the context for the book is the world after World War I. The devastation of war made parts of Europe, France, and Germany in particular, a real wasteland. And it was not a pretty war, as you can see in the photo on the right. It's a burnt-out wasteland with plumes of smoke coming out of the landscape, and the trench warfare was horrible. And this is what we see reflected in the novel as as a background to the characters of Nick and Gatsby. So here we have a poster that dates from 1917. It was an enlistment poster for the U.S. Army. And then on the right, we have F. Scott Fitzgerald in his Army uniform, looking handsome and very well put together. But let's look at the poster first. This poster dates from the year that America entered the war. And you'll see here that a King Kong-like figure with a partially clad young woman are carried away by this ape, who also carries a bloody club that has the German word Kultur on it. And what this poster is telling you is, and telling the viewer, is that while the Germans liked to hide behind their great writers and composers and artists, Beethoven and Goethe, etc., those things actually disguised or were disguising Germany's brutal nature and aggressive tendencies. And the ape is leaving a destroyed Europe in the background and now steps over the ocean onto America's soil to continue his bloody mission. Now, the war was controversial in the United States. German and Scandinavian Americans wanted to remain neutral. Lots of people wanted to remain neutral, but we did not, and in the end, we entered the war. But you can see, this is, King Kong, the movie King Kong did not really come about until the 1930s. So this is an early sort of depiction of how these brutes were seen as apes. And during the war, Fitzgerald was at Princeton at the beginning, and he was about to flunk out of Princeton University. He spent more time writing plays and having a great social life than he did studying. So he leaves Princeton and he enlists in the Army. He goes to Brooks Brothers to buy his uniform, and he was stationed briefly at Camp Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama. And this, of course, is where, as I said earlier, he meets his wife, Zelda. He had hoped so much to go over to France or to Germany and become a war hero. But just as he was about to be shipped out, the war ended. So he never saw action in the way that Gatsby or Nick Carraway did in the novel. Now, these two images show the devastating effects of the war that I was trying to describe in the slide earlier. Soldiers who in earlier times would have died of their injuries survived in a maimed condition. And particularly in Germany, German artists really depicted how the war affected the soldiers who were mangled. And on the left, we have an Otto Dix, D-I-X, image of card-playing war invalids from 1920. And you can see that one has to play cards with his feet because his arms have been blasted off. He can only hear through a microphone coming out of his ear because his ear has been completely destroyed. Another one of the players has a jaw made probably out of plastic. And then I show you on the right, really a very brutal, real images, real photographs of these war injuries. And you can see that they were absolutely horrific. And oftentimes we tend to think, so when I first saw this Otto Dix painting, when I was in my early 20s, I thought, oh, it couldn't have been that bad. He must be exaggerating. He just has a grotesque sense of the war. But literally, these people were riding around on buses in Berlin and in Paris. You were seeing these injuries on a day-to-day basis, because in the previous wars, these men probably would have died of their injuries. But with improvements in care and medicine, they were now surviving. And so there were these constant reminiscence. There was a constant reminder of the brutality of that war. And we do know that later on in life, Fitzgerald reportedly had a French war helmet on display in his home, together with a book showing just such injuries. So we know that these kinds of images probably fascinated him and haunted him. Now, besides the war, another major factor in the novel that we see throughout is prohibition, the banning of the making and selling of alcoholic beverages. Now, we recall that in 1917, after the United States entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for producing food. So it was seen as combined with the war effort, and you see that in the image on the right. Will you back me or back booze? So prohibition and America's war effort were seen very much tied together. And that same year in 1917, Congress submitted the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors for state ratification. And though Congress had stipulated a 7-year time limit for the process, the amendment passed. It got 3/4 of the United States in just 11 months. So it was highly popular at the beginning. And unfortunately, however, prohibition was very poorly enforced, particularly in the big cities like New York and Chicago. And it ended up creating organized crime as we know it today. Criminal gangs were able to gain control of the beer and liquor supply for many cities, and by the late 1920s, a new opposition mobilized nationwide. And you see that in this illustration on the left. You have Uncle Sam in the middle, and he's got prohibition on his front. And then to his left, we have the bootlegger and the dope seller. And on his right, the racketeers and the gangsters with their guns. And then right in front, of course, is depression, because by the time this cartoon was created, there had been the stock market crash in 1929 and the ensuing depression, and particularly after the stock market crash in 29 and the beginning of the Great Depression in the 30s, prohibition became very unpopular. And so you can see that, again, it's associated with things that are not good. It's gone from being something that we have to support the war effort and to keep people from getting drunk, etc., to something that's created something very bad. And in The Great Gatsby, you'll recall that Gatsby was a bootlegger, and it was rumored that he had even killed a man, and there were connections to Germany. So Fitzgerald is alluding to all of these issues about World War I and prohibition in the novel. The other thing that prohibition did is it became very much a rural state versus industrialized city, urban states. It became a point of contention because it was more easily enforced in rural areas and unbelievably poorly enforced in urban areas. So it really got people it became an urban versus rural issue, a dividing issue. And Scott Fitzgerald picks up on all of this in the novel. The other issue we need to talk about for The Great Gatsby in 1920s America is immigration. Over its history, America's had a wide variety of attitudes about immigration. I mean, look at the debate we're having today about it. But this chart shows us kind of how that looked. So for its first 100 years, the United States facilitated immigration, welcoming all these foreigners to settle. We had a huge country that needed to be in a manifest destiny. We needed to populate these vast areas of land. And beginning in the 1880s, there was an era of qualitative immigration restrictions. So this qualitative restriction began with certain types of immigrants were barred. So you couldn't come in if you were a prostitute, or workers with contracts that tied them to a particular employer for several years. They did not want any Chinese people in America. And then in the 1920s, it became more quantitative. It was numbers. It wasn't what kind of immigrant you were, but it was how many we were going to have. And in the 1920s, quantitative restrictions, or quotas as we call them, set a ceiling on the number of immigrants accepted each year. So we see the spike from 1900 to 1914 or so, and these were mostly Southern and Eastern immigrants. Eastern European immigrants, I should say, and the Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants allowed into the United States through a national origins quota. The quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 national census. And then there was a third wave between 1880 and 1940, and most of these immigrants they brought in 20 million European immigrants and an average of 650,000 a year at a time when the United States had 75 million residents. So most Southern and Eastern European immigrants arriving via New York's Ellis Island found jobs in factories in the northeastern and midwestern states. Let's take a little bit deeper dive in our next slide. So here we have two anti-immigration cartoons. One dates from 1919 and the other dates from after the First World War. And if we look at this image on the left, you can see that this is the world. America is now the world's melting pot. How many times have you heard America described as a melting pot? Well, now here's the melting pot. But what's in the melting pot? Well, Bolshevism, the red flag, communism, the mad notions of Europe, anarchy, un-American ideals. That's what's stewing in the immigrant pot. And up above it, and here's Uncle Sam again, just like we saw him in the anti-prohibition ad that we saw earlier. We can't digest the scum. So these are extremely anti-immigrant notions that were roiling around in the early 1920s. So America's always prided itself on being the melting pot and welcoming immigrants so they could realize this American dream. But there's always been this split, a contradiction in what we say about ourselves and what is really going on socially and politically. And let's just look at the cartoon on the right. Here we have all these immigrants coming off of the ship, flood of undesirable immigrants. Here's our Statue of Liberty, which is the signpost for immigration, that we welcome the hungry, the cold, the needy. That's our ideal of ourself. And then here's what's actually happening with these floods of immigrants. And then here's this bulletin. Here it's tied to, again, the war effort and the American Army. Late reports indicate American Army of unemployed now numbers between 2 and 3 millions. And then we have American Army of unemployed. So the implication, of course, is that these immigrants are taking jobs away from the veterans. And where are the immigrants going? They're not going to the farms. They're not going out into the Midwest the way the earlier immigrants had to populate the vast Midwest and West. No, they're going to the cities, and they're crowding the cities. And so you can see that this is a complicated set of emotions and thoughts around migration at the time. We always have had trouble with immigration, as these cartoons show, but these troubles that we have with immigration are in inherent odds with our vision of ourselves. So is slavery. So these are contradictions in our national character. And we say we are one thing, but we frequently act differently. And The Great Gatsby, as we shall see, is masterful in pointing out these contradictions. F. Scott Fitzgerald seemed to see every one of them and mention it in some way, bring it out in some way in the novel. Now, the fourth thing we're going to talk about, and it's the last thing for today, is the Great Migration of blacks from the South to the North. They were coming because there was opportunity, there was economic opportunity. And living in the South at that time, there were lots of lynchings going on. There were things called the Jim Crow laws that blacks were trying to escape. And so they migrated from these southern areas up to the north. You know, Kentucky going to Cleveland and to Ohio. People were going from Virginia up into Maryland and Delaware, and people from Tennessee coming over here again to Virginia. And so there was this great migration of blacks coming from the South to the North right around the 1920s. And in New York City in particular, a major pocket of black culture coalesced in Harlem, and we have the Harlem Renaissance, and it becomes so important to American culture. We get the great music of the 20s and 30s, and it creates the jazz age. And actually, F. Scott Fitzgerald was the person who coined that phrase, the jazz age. So without this migration coming up from the South and coalescing in the large urban areas of the North, we would not have had this very rich culture that we see in the 1920s and which F. Scott Fitzgerald captures in the novel. And we see again that coming from rural cities, and we see a migrant family in their rural setting on the left, we started to create a black middle class, and the development of Harlem and these cultural shifts. Blacks then entered into a urban atmosphere. And this again, just like Prohibition, set a new tone between the rural atmosphere and the urban atmosphere that was just growing up and developing at the time. So certainly these migrations, the sudden appearance of many, many more blacks in New York City in particular, is also reflected in the novel. So here I show you Gatsby's house as seen in Baz Luhrmann's Great Gatsby movie. I believe the date of that movie was 2013. But you can see this spectacular atmosphere that F. Scott Fitzgerald has been able to imagine for us. And so we've seen these pretty heavy-duty issues: immigration, war, a great migration of blacks from the South to the North. We've seen some of these things that Prohibition, which created a lot of chaos in the country. And out of that, out of all of those issues, less than a decade after the war, and as Prohibition and strict immigration laws were put in place, Fitzgerald seems to create this magical world full of rich people and great parties and houses on the water. And so you must always look at the atmosphere that F. Scott Fitzgerald creates against the fairly challenging times that we've talked about in this presentation. The language he uses, the descriptions, the phrases are all so very beautiful, but they do hide a deeper, ugly reality underneath, and you always have to read the novel in that way. Now, in the videos to come, we're going to take a look at all of that and see how F. Scott Fitzgerald really masterfully and beautifully lays all of this out for us. So check out my other videos in this series and follow me and like the video. I also welcome all your comments, and thank you for turning into this series. In the next video, we're going to talk about the major characters to make sure you follow my channel so that you get that and other videos. Bye for now.